Beneath the jungles of Vietnam, while American soldiers walked above searching for an enemy they could barely see, an entire world existed underground. A world of narrow passages, hidden rooms, hospitals, kitchens, sleeping quarters, and command centers. A world that stretched for hundreds of miles, connecting villages, providing sanctuary, and ultimately helping to change the course of one of the most significant conflicts of the 20th century. This is the story of the tunnels of Cu Chi, and the broader network of underground passages that became one of the most ingenious and effective defensive systems ever created. This is the story of how Vietnamese fighters turned the earth itself into a weapon, and how they used it to outlast the most powerful military force on the planet. Imagine, for a moment, that you're standing in a dense Vietnamese jungle in 1966. The air is thick with humidity, so heavy you feel like you're breathing water. Mosquitoes swarm around you. The canopy above is so dense that even at midday the light that reaches the forest floor is dim and green. You're an American soldier, thousands of miles from home, hunting an enemy that seems to vanish into thin air. You clear a village, search every hut, find nothing. You patrol an area, take fire, return fire, and when you advance, there's nobody there, just empty jungle. But you have this persistent, unsettling feeling that you're being watched, that eyes are on you from somewhere you can't see. And you're right, because beneath your boots, sometimes only a few feet down, the enemy is there, listening to you, watching you through hidden observation posts, waiting. The tunnel systems of Vietnam, particularly the famous Cu Chi tunnels near Saigon, weren't built specifically for the American War, as the Vietnamese call it. Their origins go back further, to an earlier struggle. In the 1940s, when Vietnam was fighting for independence from French colonial rule, villagers in the Cu Chi district northwest of Saigon began digging tunnels. These early tunnels were simple, short passages used primarily for hiding weapons, sheltering from French patrols, and moving between villages without being detected. The soil in this region was particularly suited for tunneling. It was a special kind of clay, laterite, that was soft enough to dig through with simple tools, but hard enough that it wouldn't collapse easily. It held its shape. During the dry season, it became almost as hard as concrete. When the French finally left Vietnam in 1954 and the country was divided into North and South, these tunnels weren't forgotten. In fact, they became more important. The Cu Chi district, ironically, was located in an area that became part of South Vietnam, the American backside. But the people of Cu Chi and surrounding regions had strong sympathies with the Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla forces fighting against the South Vietnamese government. As the conflict intensified in the early 1960s and American involvement grew, these villagers and fighters made a collective decision. They would expand the tunnels. They would dig deeper, farther, more complex. They would create an entire underground infrastructure that could sustain a war. And dig they did, using the most basic tools you can imagine. Handheld hoes, short-handled picks, baskets for carrying dirt. No modern machinery, no power tools. Everything done by hand, often by candlelight or in complete darkness. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Diggers worked in shifts, sometimes spending 12 to 14 hours underground, breathing stale air, their bodies contorted in spaces so small they couldn't stand, or sometimes even sit upright. They dug, and they carried the excavated soil away in baskets, disposing of it carefully so that, from the air, there would be no telltale mounds of fresh earth to give away the tunnel's locations. They scattered it in rivers, mixed it into rice paddies, hid it under vegetation. The attention to camouflage was extraordinary. By the time American combat forces arrived in large numbers in 1965, the tunnel system around Cu Chi alone stretched for over 150 miles. But this wasn't just one long tunnel. It was a network, a maze, multiple levels deep. There were primary tunnels, larger passages where a person could crouch and move. There were secondary tunnels, narrower and lower. There were tertiary tunnels, so small that you had to crawl on your belly, pulling yourself forward with your elbows. The system had 3 distinct levels. The first level, closest to the surface, was typically between 3 to 6 feet underground. This level contained trapdoors to the surface, fighting positions, and observation posts. The second level, between 6 to 12 feet down, contained living quarters, storage rooms, and kitchens. The third level, sometimes 20 feet or more underground, provided the deepest shelter during bombing raids and artillery strikes. The entrances to these tunnels were works of art in themselves. Trapdoors were incredibly well camouflaged. They might be covered with leaves and vegetation that looked completely natural. They might be disguised as part of a termite mound, something soldiers had learned not to disturb. They might be hidden in the floor of a hut, under a cooking pot, beneath a sleeping mat. Some trapdoors were designed with a double-layered system, where even if you found the first door, there was a second hidden layer below. The doors themselves were made to be exactly the right size, fitting so perfectly into their frames that even if you stepped directly on one, it might not give way or sound hollow. And they were counterbalanced, using simple mechanical principles so that a person inside could easily push them open, but someone above would have tremendous difficulty pulling them up. Inside the tunnels, life was almost unimaginably difficult. The passages were built small deliberately. The Vietnamese fighters who used them were generally smaller in stature than American soldiers, and the tunnels were designed to maximize this advantage. The average tunnel was less than 3 feet high and barely 2 feet wide. To move through them, you had to duck walk in a crouch position or crawl. For taller Americans who would later enter these tunnels in pursuit, the experience was claustrophobic nightmare. But it was hardly comfortable for the Vietnamese either. The air inside was stifling, especially during the hot season. Oxygen levels could drop dangerously low. The darkness was absolute. The heat was oppressive. And yet, people lived down there, not just for hours or days, but sometimes for months at a time. The tunnel complexes included everything needed to sustain life and continue fighting. There were sleeping chambers where fighters rested on simple bamboo platforms. There were meeting rooms where commanders planned operations. There were weapons storage areas, carefully organized and maintained. There were workshops where fighters repaired weapons and manufactured crude explosives and booby traps. There were medical stations where wounded fighters received treatment, often without anesthesia, with only the most basic medical supplies, by doctors and nurses working by candlelight in spaces where they couldn't stand upright. There were kitchens, though cooking was particularly challenging. Smoke from cooking fires could give away the tunnel locations, so the Vietnamese engineers designed ingenious ventilation systems, creating chimneys that vented smoke far from the actual cooking location, sometimes hundreds of feet away, and filtering it through earth and vegetation so it dispersed without creating a visible plume. There were water wells dug within the tunnel systems, providing access to fresh water without needing to surface. There were food storage areas where rice, dried fish, and other supplies were kept. There were even primitive hospitals where surgery could be performed. The operating tables were just wooden boards. The surgical instruments were often crude and had to be used over and over, cleaned as best as possible in boiling water. Antibiotics and pain medication were scarce. Infections were common and often fatal, and yet, the medical corps of the Viet Cong managed to save lives and keep fighters returning to battle under conditions that would be unthinkable in any modern military. The psychological dimension of living underground cannot be overstated. Human beings aren't meant to live like moles. We need sunlight, fresh air, the ability to stand upright and move freely. The tunnel dwellers had none of these things for extended periods. They developed health problems. Their skin became pale and unhealthy from lack of sun. Their joints ached from constant crouching. Their lungs suffered from breathing stale, dusty air. Many developed a distinctive cough. Their eyes, adapted to darkness, would water and ache in bright sunlight when they finally emerged. Malaria was rampant. So were dysentery and other intestinal diseases. Parasites were a constant problem. Venomous snakes and scorpions sometimes made their way into the tunnels, and in the confined darkness, encountering one was terrifying. But here's the remarkable thing. Despite all of this hardship, despite the physical suffering and psychological strain, the morale of the tunnel fighters remained extraordinarily high. Why? Because they believed in what they were fighting for. They saw themselves as defending their homeland against a foreign invader. They drew strength from their community, from fighting alongside neighbors and family members they had known their entire lives. They were sustained by a conviction that if they could just endure long enough, if they could just survive and continue resisting, eventually the Americans would leave. And they were right. When American forces began major operations in the Cu Chi area, they were baffled by what they encountered. Entire Viet Cong units would seem to disappear. Patrols would take fire from a location, call in artillery or air strikes, then move in to find nothing but empty jungle. Villages would appear deserted, but intelligence indicated they were Viet Cong strongholds. Where was everyone? The Americans initially didn't understand the scale or sophistication of what lay beneath their feet. When they first began discovering tunnels, they assumed they were just individual hiding spots or small shelters. It took time for them to realize they were dealing with something far more extensive. The discovery process itself was often terrifying. A soldier might step on ground that gave way slightly, or spot something that didn't look quite right. Investigating, they might find a trap door, but opening it meant exposing yourself to potential fire from below. The Viet Cong would sometimes station a fighter with a weapon just below a known entrance, waiting for someone to open it. Even if there wasn't an immediate threat, what you found when you looked down was absolute darkness and a space far too small for comfort. Who knew what was down there? Who knew how far it went or what traps might be waiting? The American military's initial response to the tunnels was to try to destroy them. They used explosives, pumping charges into the tunnels and detonating them, hoping to collapse the passages. But the tunnels were deeper and more extensive than they realized. Explosions might collapse a section, but the network was so vast that it made little overall difference. They tried pumping water into the tunnels to flood them, but the Vietnamese had dug sumps and drainage systems that channeled water away. They tried pumping in tear gas and other chemical irritants, which was more effective but still limited because the tunnel systems had multiple entrances and exits, creating airflow that eventually cleared the gas. Then they tried something that sounds almost medieval, but became one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. They sent men down into the tunnels to fight there. These men became known as tunnel rats, and they were a special breed. Tunnel rats were volunteers, usually smaller men, who could more easily navigate the tight spaces, though size alone wasn't enough. You needed a particular kind of mental toughness to do this job. You had to be willing to crawl into absolute darkness, into spaces where you couldn't turn around, or sometimes even back up, knowing that around the next bend, there might be an enemy fighter waiting with a knife or a pistol. There might be a booby trap, a pit with sharpened stakes, a hidden grenade rigged to explode. There might be scorpions or snakes. The tunnel might dead end, leaving you stuck. It might flood. It might collapse. Every forward movement was an act of courage that most people literally cannot imagine. Tunnel rats worked in pairs or small teams. They carried minimal equipment because space was so limited, usually just a flashlight, though often they worked in darkness because a light made you a target. A pistol, typically a .45 caliber, or a silenced .22, because firing a rifle in the enclosed space would be deafening and disorienting. A knife, maybe a length of communication wire if they wanted to stay in contact with the surface. Some carried a piece of string that they tied off as they advanced so they could find their way back in the maze-like darkness. They would enter a tunnel, crawl forward, map what they found, engage any enemy if they encountered them, and try to determine the tunnel's purpose and extent. The psychological warfare in the tunnels went both ways. The Viet Cong would sometimes leave behind confusing pathways, dead ends, and false trails to disorient tunnel rats. They would leave booby traps specifically designed for the confined spaces, a grenade positioned so that moving forward would dislodge a pin, boards with nails pointing upward, waiting for a crawling hand or knee, hidden pits. Sometimes they would leave behind documents or equipment in obvious places, making them seem carelessly abandoned, but they were actually bait for traps. Other times, Viet Cong fighters would deliberately engage tunnel rats briefly, then retreat deeper into the tunnels, drawing them forward into ambush sites. The tunnel rats developed their own techniques and culture. They had a dark gallows humor about their work, because what else could you do when your job was to crawl into what might be your grave? They became expert at reading the subtle signs in the tunnels. A draft of fresher air might indicate an exit nearby. A smell of cooking or tobacco might mean inhabitants were close. The texture of the floor could tell you if people had been moving through recently. They learned to move silently, to breathe shallowly, to become almost part of the darkness themselves. Some developed an almost preternatural sense of danger, a feeling when something wasn't right that would make them freeze or back up. And often that instinct saved their lives. The Vietnamese fighters had enormous respect for the tunnel rats. Even as they fought them, these were men who came into the tunnels, into the home territory of the Viet Cong, into spaces designed to give every advantage to the defenders. That took a kind of bravery that transcended sides in the conflict. There are accounts of brief, violent encounters in the tunnels that ended with both sides backing away, neither willing to pursue further in the nightmare conditions. There are stories of tunnel rats finding wounded Viet Cong fighters in the tunnels and, rather than killing them, marking the location and moving on. The tunnels created a strange, intimate form of warfare where the normal distances of modern combat collapsed into darkness and earth. Despite the efforts of the tunnel rats and the various attempts to destroy the tunnels, the Americans were never able to eliminate them as a factor in the war. The network was simply too extensive, too deep, too well constructed. By the late 1960s, American strategy shifted toward trying to deny the use of the tunnels rather than destroy them completely. They created free fire zones in areas with heavy tunnel concentrations, areas where anyone found would be considered hostile and engaged. They used massive bombing campaigns, including B-52 strikes, to crater the landscape and hopefully collapse tunnels. They defoliated vast areas with Agent Orange and other herbicides to remove the jungle cover that concealed tunnel entrances. These tactics caused enormous damage and suffering. The bombing of Cu Chi and surrounding districts was so intense that the landscape was transformed. Forests were reduced to wastelands of bomb craters. Villages were destroyed. Thousands of civilians were killed or displaced. The herbicide spraying poisoned the land and created health problems that persist to this day, including birth defects and cancers in subsequent generations. The American military created what they called the Iron Triangle, a heavily bombed area that included Cu Chi, trying to make it uninhabitable. And still, the tunnels survived. Fighters lived in them. Operations continued from them. The tunnels remained, scarred and damaged, but functional, a stubborn underground resistance that would not be eliminated. The tunnels weren't just defensive structures. They were offensive weapons. Fighters would emerge from hidden entrances to launch surprise attacks, then vanish back underground before American forces could respond effectively. They would place mines and booby traps on paths and roads, then withdraw to the tunnels to avoid the inevitable retaliation. They would use the tunnels to move supplies and personnel without being detected by American aircraft or patrols. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the famous supply route from North to South Vietnam, included tunnel sections that allowed men and materials to pass through heavily patrolled areas undetected. The tunnels also served a crucial strategic purpose by forcing American forces to concentrate enormous resources on relatively small geographic areas. Entire operations were mounted to try to clear tunnel complexes. Thousands of soldiers would be committed to searching for and destroying tunnels in a single district. Artillery would pound areas for days. Aircraft would drop tons of bombs. And when it was over, the Americans might control the surface, but the tunnels remained, and the Viet Cong would simply wait until the Americans moved on to the next operation, then re-emerge and continue their activities. This pattern repeated over and over. It was frustrating, demoralizing, and ultimately unsustainable for the American military. There's a broader lesson here about asymmetric warfare that the Vietnam tunnels illustrate perfectly. The United States had overwhelming technological and firepower superiority. They had aircraft that could rain destruction from the sky. They had artillery that could devastate any target. They had helicopters for rapid deployment. They had night vision equipment, motion sensors, chemical weapons, and more resources than the Viet Cong could dream of. And yet, none of that technological superiority could reach into those tunnels effectively. None of it could force out an enemy willing to endure incredible hardship. The tunnels negated American advantages and created a battlefield where determination and endurance mattered more than technology. The human cost on the Vietnamese side was staggering. We don't know exact figures, and we probably never will, but tens of thousands of Vietnamese fighters and civilians died in or because of the tunnels. They died in collapsed tunnels during bombing raids. They died of suffocation when ventilation failed. They died of disease and infection. They died fighting tunnel rats in the darkness. They died slowly of malnutrition and illness. But from the Vietnamese perspective, these sacrifices were necessary and meaningful. They were defending their country, their villages, their families. The tunnels allowed them to survive and fight, despite facing an enemy with vastly superior resources. That made the suffering worthwhile in their eyes. Life in the tunnels created a unique culture and camaraderie. People who lived underground together for months or years formed bonds that were incredibly strong. They depended on each other absolutely. In the darkness and danger, trust was everything. They shared food when it was scarce, looked after each other when sick, covered for each other in combat. They told stories and sang songs to keep their spirits up. They celebrated small victories and mourned losses together. They fell in love and formed relationships, even in those hellish conditions. Babies were born in the tunnels, though how any infant survived in that environment seems miraculous. Old people lived and died there, refusing to leave even when they could. The tunnels also became repositories of Vietnamese cultural resistance. Underground chambers contained schools where children learned to read and write. There were theatrical performances, plays, and songs celebrating Vietnamese history and mocking the Americans. There were newspapers and newsletters printed on crude presses, spreading information and propaganda. There were workshops where local craftsmen continued traditional work, maintaining cultural practices even while living like refugees in their own land. The tunnels became more than military installations. They were communities, underground cities where Vietnamese life continued in defiance of the war raging above. When American forces finally withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, and when Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces in 1975, the tunnels had served their purpose. They had allowed the Viet Cong and their supporters to outlast the American presence. They had provided sanctuary, enabled resistance, and ultimately contributed significantly to the communist victory. It's impossible to say the tunnels alone won the war for Vietnam. The conflict was far more complex, involving international politics, military strategy on multiple fronts, domestic American opposition to the war, and countless other factors. But it's equally impossible to imagine the outcome being the same without the tunnels. They were a crucial element in Vietnam's ability to resist. After the war, the tunnels were largely abandoned. Some sections collapsed naturally. Some were filled in deliberately. The people who had lived in them were eager to return to life above ground, to rebuild their villages and farms, to live normal lives again after years of deprivation. But some sections of the tunnels were preserved, particularly around Cu Chi, which became a war memorial and tourist site. Today you can visit Cu Chi and go into the tunnels, though the sections open to tourists have been enlarged significantly to accommodate visitors who are generally larger than the Vietnamese fighters who originally used them. Even enlarged, the experience is claustrophobic and uncomfortable, giving only a hint of what the original conditions were like. Walking through those preserved tunnels today, even as a tourist in relative safety, you can't help but be awed by what was accomplished there. The sheer physical labor of digging all those miles of tunnels by hand, the ingenuity of the design with its ventilation systems and hidden entrances and multiple levels, the endurance of the people who lived there, fighting a war while subsisting in conditions that seem barely compatible with human life. Whether you agree with the cause they were fighting for or not, the achievement itself commands respect. They took the most basic resources, earth and human determination, and created something that stymied the most powerful military in the world. The legacy of the tunnels extends beyond Vietnam. Military planners around the world studied them, learning lessons about asymmetric warfare, about the limitations of technology against a determined, dug-in enemy. The tunnels of Cu Chi are taught in military academies as examples of successful defensive engineering and guerrilla tactics. They influence thinking about how to fight insurgencies and how insurgents might resist superior forces. You can see echoes of the Vietnam tunnel systems in conflicts from the Middle East to Afghanistan, where fighters have used caves, tunnels, and underground networks to resist conventional military forces. There's also a human dimension to the legacy. The veterans who fought in and around those tunnels, both American and Vietnamese, carry the experience with them. For American veterans, particularly the tunnel rats, the memories are often traumatic. Many suffer from PTSD related to their experiences underground. The darkness, the fear, the violence in confined spaces, these are not easily forgotten. Support groups and veteran organizations have worked to help tunnel rats and others affected by their experiences. But the wounds, physical and psychological, remain. For Vietnamese veterans, the memories are complex. Pride in what they accomplished and survived, mixed with grief for friends lost and years stolen, mixed with the ongoing health problems many suffer from their time underground. The tunnels also represent something important about the nature of war itself, and about what people will endure to defend their homes. The Vietnamese who built and lived in those tunnels weren't motivated by ideology alone, though that was part of it. They were motivated by a desire to protect their villages, their families, their way of life. They saw foreign soldiers on their land, foreign aircraft bombing their fields, foreign chemicals poisoning their forests, and they responded by literally going underground, creating a world beneath the world where they could continue existing and resisting. It's a powerful testament to human resilience and determination. In the end, the secret tunnel system of Vietnam tells us several things. It tells us that technology and firepower don't guarantee victory. It tells us that people fighting for their homes have advantages that can't be measured in tonnage of bombs or sophistication of weapons. It tells us that human beings can adapt to and endure almost anything when sufficiently motivated. It tells us that asymmetric warfare, where a weaker force uses unconventional tactics to negate the advantages of a stronger force, can be devastatingly effective. And it tells us that the Earth itself, properly used, can become a formidable ally in war. The tunnels of Cu Chi and the broader network of underground passages throughout Vietnam were more than just military installations. They were statements of defiance, monuments to endurance, and ultimately crucial factors in one side's ability to outlast the other in a long, brutal conflict. They helped Vietnam defeat the United States not through superior firepower or technology, but through superior will, ingenuity, and the determination to suffer whatever was necessary to win. Those narrow, dark passages, dug by hand through clay soil, became one of the most effective defensive systems in military history. They're a reminder that in war, as in life, the greatest resources aren't always the most obvious ones. Sometimes, the greatest resource is simply the refusal to give up, the determination to survive, and the creativity to use whatever you have, even if all you have is dirt, darkness, and determination. That's the real secret of the tunnel system that helped Vietnam win the war. The story of these tunnels also raises profound questions about the nature of warfare and human cost that we must confront honestly. When we talk about military strategy and tactical victories, it's easy to lose sight of what those tunnels actually meant in human terms. Every foot of those passages was dug by someone's hands. Every hour spent underground was an hour of someone's life, lived in conditions that we would consider intolerable. Every person who died in those tunnels had a name, a family, dreams that would never be realized. The tunnels were effective, yes, but their effectiveness came at a price paid in human suffering on a scale that's difficult to fully comprehend. Consider the children who grew up in and around these tunnel systems. There were kids who spent formative years of their childhood underground, who learned to crawl through dark passages before they learned to read, who thought of bomb shelters and hidden entrances as normal parts of life. There were teenagers who became fighters before they had a chance to be anything else, who spent what should have been years of education and growth, instead learning how to set booby traps and navigate tunnel networks in pitch darkness. These children had their childhood stolen by war, and the tunnels, while protecting them physically, couldn't protect them from the psychological damage of growing up in constant fear and deprivation. The elderly, too, played crucial roles in the tunnel communities. Grandmothers and grandfathers who stayed in the villages, who refused to evacuate even when given the chance, who maintained the tunnel entrances and helped with cooking and childcare underground. Many of these old people had already lived through the war against the French, had already endured one conflict, and now found themselves living through another. They brought wisdom and continuity to the underground communities, teaching younger generations about Vietnamese history and culture, ensuring that even in the darkness beneath the earth, the essence of their society survived. But they also paid a terrible price, spending their final years in hardship when they should have been enjoying peace and the respect their age deserved. The medical challenges in the tunnels were particularly horrific and deserve more attention. Imagine being a doctor or nurse trying to provide health care in those conditions. You're working in a space where you can't stand up straight, where light is scarce, where you can't properly sterilize instruments, where you have minimal supplies. A wounded fighter is brought to you, carried through narrow tunnels, bleeding, in shock, in agony. You have no anesthesia, or perhaps a tiny amount that you have to ration carefully. You have to perform surgery by candlelight or flashlight, contorting your body to work in the confined space, knowing that infection is almost inevitable, knowing that your patient's chances are slim, even if the surgery is successful. The medics in the tunnels faced impossible ethical dilemmas constantly. When supplies were scarce, who got the limited antibiotics? The fighter who could return to combat quickest, or the person whose need was most desperate? When morphine ran out, how did you manage someone's pain? Vietnamese traditional medicine helped some. Herbal remedies and acupuncture techniques passed down through generations. But for serious wounds, for shattered bones and torn organs and severe burns, traditional medicine could only do so much. The doctors and nurses watched people die who could have been saved easily in a proper hospital. They watched infections spread. They watched gangrene set in. They made amputations with handsaws, trying to save lives by taking limbs. And they did all of this underground, in the dark, in the heat, breathing stale air, themselves malnourished and exhausted. The women in the tunnels played roles that are often overlooked in military histories, but were absolutely crucial. While Vietnamese women did serve as fighters, many more served in support roles that kept the tunnel communities functioning. They cooked, they nursed the wounded, they carried supplies, they maintained the tunnel entrances, they gathered intelligence. They did this while often caring for children, while pregnant, while elderly. The women of Cu Chi and other tunnel districts showed extraordinary courage and endurance. There are accounts of women giving birth in the tunnels, then returning to work within days because there was no choice. Because everyone's contribution was needed for survival. Some women served as guides through the tunnel systems, memorizing the complex pathways and able to navigate them in complete darkness. This was crucial because the tunnels were deliberately confusing, with false passages and dead ends designed to disorient enemies. Having guides who knew every turn, every hidden door, every shortcut, was essential for moving fighters and supplies efficiently. These women would lead groups through the darkness, walking ahead by memory and touch, their knowledge of the tunnels as valuable as any weapon. The psychological warfare aspects of the tunnels extended in directions that are sometimes forgotten. The Viet Cong would use the tunnels to create a sense of the supernatural, playing on local beliefs and superstitions. They would appear and disappear seemingly, at will, creating stories among the local population of ghosts and spirits. This served multiple purposes. It helped protect tunnel entrances because people believed certain areas were haunted and avoided them. It intimidated enemy forces who heard stories from locals about spirits and mysterious disappearances. And it boosted morale among their own fighters, creating a mythology around their movement that made them seem invincible. The Americans tried psychological warfare of their own. They would use loudspeakers to broadcast into tunnel areas, offering amnesty to fighters who surrendered, playing music meant to demoralize, making threats. They dropped leaflets promising rewards for information about tunnel locations. Some of these tactics worked to a degree. The Chio Hoi program, which offered amnesty to Viet Cong who surrendered, did bring some people over, but the vast majority of tunnel dwellers remained committed to the fight, and the psychological operations had limited impact on those living underground, where they couldn't easily hear the broadcasts or see the leaflets. The animals that lived in and around the tunnels add another dimension to the story. The Vietnamese fighters kept some animals underground, small dogs sometimes, useful for warning of danger or providing companionship. Chickens occasionally, though keeping livestock underground was difficult. But the real animal inhabitants of the tunnels were the ones that came uninvited. Rats were constant companions, attracted by food stores and the warmth of human bodies. Some fighters claimed the rats would warn them of bombing raids, becoming agitated before the bombs fell. Snakes were a serious danger. Several species of venomous snakes would make their way into the tunnels, and in the darkness, stepping on or reaching past, a snake could be fatal. Bats roosted in some sections, and while they generally avoided people, disturbing a colony could be terrifying in the confined space. The Viet Cong actually weaponized some of these animals in their booby traps. Venomous snakes would be placed in boxes or baskets rigged to open when disturbed. Scorpions would be positioned in small chambers where an unwary hand might reach. These creature-based traps were particularly effective against tunnel rats because they added an element of unpredictability and primal fear to the already terrifying experience of crawling through enemy tunnels. Even hardened soldiers who could face bullets and explosives with courage might panic when confronting a venomous snake in pitch darkness with no room to maneuver. The sensory deprivation of tunnel life affected people in profound ways. Human senses are designed for the surface world, for light and sound and open space. In the tunnels, all of that was taken away. Vision became almost useless in the frequent total darkness. Hearing became hypersensitive. Every sound magnified and distorted by the enclosed space. The constant sound of one's own breathing, the scrape of clothing against earth, the distant rumble of bombs, all of it echoed and reverberated in ways that could be disorienting. The sense of smell became acute, able to detect the subtle differences between fresh air from a distant entrance and the stale, oxygen-depleted air of deep chambers. Touch became the primary sense for navigation, hands and knees reading the texture of the tunnel floor and walls. This sensory environment had lasting effects. Tunnel veterans often reported difficulty adjusting to normal life afterward. Bright lights were painful. Open spaces felt exposing and dangerous. Loud noises caused panic attacks. The hypervigilance necessary for survival underground became a permanent state that made peacetime life difficult. Sleep disturbances were nearly universal, with nightmares of being trapped, of tunnels collapsing, of enemies appearing in the darkness. These were symptoms of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term wasn't widely used during the Vietnam War era. The logistical challenges of keeping the tunnel communities supplied were enormous and often underappreciated. Everything needed underground had to be brought in from the surface, transported through narrow passages, often carried long distances. Rice, the staple food, was relatively easy to transport in sacks, but it required water and fuel to cook. Water could be obtained from underground wells in some locations, but in others it had to be carried in from the surface in containers small enough to fit through the tunnels. Fuel for cooking fires was a constant problem. Wood smoke could give away positions, so special types of wood that produced minimal smoke had to be found and transported. Medical supplies were desperately scarce and had to be used with extreme care. A bottle of antibiotics might have to serve dozens of people. Bandages would be washed and reused until they fell apart. Surgical instruments, already limited, had to be maintained and sharpened constantly. The supply situation was so difficult that fighters would risk their lives to retrieve equipment from dead enemy soldiers. American medical supplies, weapons, and equipment found on casualties were treasured prizes. Even small things like matches, plastic bags, or batteries could be incredibly valuable in the tunnel environment. Weapons maintenance in the tunnels required constant attention and creativity. The humidity and dust underground were terrible for firearms. Metal would rust, mechanisms would jam, ammunition could become compromised. Fighters would spend hours cleaning and oiling their weapons by candlelight, making sure they would function when needed. But cleaning supplies were limited, so they used whatever was available: oil from cooking, grease from captured vehicles, even animal fat, anything that could protect metal from corrosion. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Every bullet mattered. Fighters were expected to make every shot count, and there are accounts of Viet Cong snipers who would use just a few rounds to inflict casualties, then immediately retreat into the tunnels before retaliation could come. The tunnel systems also served as manufacturing centers for weapons and explosives. In hidden workshops underground, fighters would create mines and booby traps from unexploded American ordnance. This was incredibly dangerous work. They would carefully disassemble bombs and artillery shells that had failed to detonate, extracting the explosive material and repurposing it. One mistake, one spark, one moment of carelessness, and the explosion would kill everyone in that section of tunnel and possibly cause a collapse. But the work continued because the Viet Cong needed explosives, and unexploded American ordnance was a ready source. It's a bitter irony that American weapons that failed to explode on impact often ended up being turned against American soldiers. The command and control aspects of tunnel warfare were sophisticated and often brilliant. The tunnel systems allowed Viet Cong commanders to maintain communication and coordination, even when American forces controlled the surface. Runners would carry messages through the tunnels, traveling safely underground while American patrols searched above. Some tunnel complexes had dedicated communication chambers where radio operators could work, with special ventilation to disperse the heat from the equipment and careful shielding to prevent radio signals from being easily detected. Maps of the tunnel systems were carefully guarded and often memorized rather than written down, preventing them from falling into enemy hands. Commanders could plan operations in relative safety underground. then send fighters to the surface through hidden exits to execute attacks. After an ambush or raid, fighters could quickly retreat underground, scattering through different passages to make pursuit difficult. This hit-and-run capability was one of the tunnel system's greatest military advantages. The Americans might bring overwhelming force to an area after an attack, but by the time they arrived, the attackers would be safely underground, possibly miles away through tunnel passages, or simply waiting in hidden chambers until the Americans left. The intelligence gathering from the tunnels was another crucial advantage. Observation posts hidden in the jungle floor allowed Viet Cong spotters to watch American movements without being seen. They could count troop numbers, identify unit patches and insignia, note movement patterns and times. This information would be passed back through the tunnels to commanders who could use it to plan attacks. The tunnels also allowed Viet Cong agents to remain in areas under American control, emerging at night to gather information or conduct operations, then hiding underground during daylight hours. There's an aspect of the tunnel warfare that's rarely discussed, but was crucial to its effectiveness: the support it received from the civilian population. The tunnels couldn't have functioned without the help of villagers who appeared to be neutral civilians, but were actually part of the resistance network. Old women who seemed harmless might be concealing tunnel entrances under their cooking fires. Children playing might be watching American patrols and would report their movements. Farmers working their fields might be covering fresh excavations or noting locations where Americans concentrated their forces. This blurring of the line between civilian and combatant was one of the most difficult aspects of the war for American soldiers, who often couldn't tell who was friendly and who was hostile. This created terrible moral dilemmas and tragic outcomes. American soldiers, frustrated by an enemy they couldn't find, sometimes took out their anger on civilians they suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. This led to atrocities and war crimes, most infamously at My Lai, but in many other instances as well. The tunnel warfare contributed to this tragedy by making it genuinely difficult to distinguish between innocent civilians and active combatants. A village elder might truly be just an old man, or he might be a Viet Cong commander. A woman carrying rice might be feeding her family, or she might be supplying fighters in the tunnels. The ambiguity was agonizing and led to outcomes that haunted American veterans and devastated Vietnamese communities. The impact of massive bombing campaigns on the tunnel systems and their inhabitants is almost beyond description. When B-52 bombers dropped their payloads on tunnel areas, the earth itself seemed to convulse. People underground would feel the impacts through the ground, a rolling, terrifying sensation, as if the world was coming apart. The pressure waves from nearby explosions could rupture eardrums, collapse lungs, cause internal bleeding. Tunnels would collapse, burying people alive. The darkness would fill with dust so thick you couldn't breathe. The sound was beyond deafening. It was overwhelming, annihilating all other sensation. Those who survived bombing raids in the tunnels describe a kind of terror that never fully leaves you. Being underground during a bombardment, you're completely helpless. You can't run, you can't fight back. You can only huddle in the darkness and hope that the next bomb doesn't hit directly above you. After the bombing stopped, survivors would have to dig through collapsed sections to rescue people who were trapped or recover bodies. Sometimes people would be buried alive, and their screams would echo through the tunnels as others frantically dug to reach them, racing against time before suffocation or another bombing run. Despite all of this, despite the terror and the casualties and the destruction, the tunnel dwellers persisted. Their persistence is one of the most remarkable aspects of this story. After bombing raids, after chemical attacks, after tunnel rat incursions, they would repair the damage and continue. They would dig out collapsed sections, shore up weakened areas, create new passages to replace destroyed ones. The work was endless. The tunnels required constant maintenance even without enemy action. The tropical rains would seep in, weakening the earth. Tree roots would grow through passages and need to be cleared. The simple passage of people and equipment would wear away the floors and walls. But the maintenance continued, the repairs continued, the digging continued, because giving up meant defeat and death. The end of the war didn't immediately end the story of the tunnels. When Saigon fell in April 1975 and the war ended, the tunnels were no longer needed for fighting, but they remained as physical evidence of what had occurred. The land around Cu Chi was so cratered and damaged that it was effectively uninhabitable and agriculturally useless for years. Unexploded ordnance littered the area, killing and maiming people long after the fighting stopped. The tunnels themselves were dangerous, liable to collapse without maintenance, filled with traps that hadn't been disarmed, with weapons and explosives that had been left behind. Children exploring the tunnels in the post-war years were killed or injured, a tragic coda to the tunnel story. The Vietnamese government eventually made the decision to preserve sections of the Cu Chi tunnels as a memorial and tourist site. This was partly to honor those who had fought and suffered there, partly to educate future generations about the war, and partly because the tunnels had become internationally famous and there was interest from visitors. The preserved sections were enlarged and improved to make them safer and more accessible, which means visitors today don't experience the tunnels as they actually were during the war. But even the modified version gives a powerful impression. Walking through those tunnels today as a visitor, even in the widened, well-lit sections, is still challenging. The air is still close and humid. The spaces are still confined. It's still psychologically difficult to be underground in narrow passages, knowing you're surrounded by earth on all sides. And yet, you're there voluntarily, you can leave at any time. There's no danger, no enemy, no bombs falling above. Trying to imagine what it was like during the war, trying to truly grasp what the fighters and civilians endured, is nearly impossible. The physical environment gives you a hint, but the fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, the constant danger, these can't be recreated or fully communicated. The tunnels of Cu Chi and the broader Vietnamese tunnel systems represent something important about the nature of human conflict and human endurance. They show us that people defending their homes, fighting on their own ground, can find ways to resist even overwhelming force. They show us that suffering can be endured when there's purpose behind it. They show us that technology and firepower, while important, aren't everything in war. They show us that the human spirit, for better or worse, is capable of adapting to almost anything. These are uncomfortable lessons because they suggest that military superiority doesn't guarantee victory, that wars can't be won simply by having better weapons. That determination and willingness to sacrifice can overcome tremendous disadvantages. These are lessons that powerful nations don't like to learn, but they're lessons that history teaches repeatedly. The tunnels of Vietnam are just one particularly vivid example of these enduring truths about war, resistance, and the terrible things human beings will do and endure when they believe their cause is just.